Trump is out of the White House, and good riddance. But I think that the celebrations of Trump's departure among liberals and even some on the left has amounted to varying degrees of cheerleading for Biden, especially over foreign policy. And I thought that I could kind of use this meeting to go into that a little bit and try and dissect where imperialism comes from and how we can organize against it. So I think the first thing to note of the outgoing administration is that there is no truth to the claims by some that Trump was isolationist or even anti-war. Yes, it's true that he didn't start any new wars, but he came mighty close with North Korea and following the assassination of Iran's General Soleimani. He dropped the mother of all bombs on Afghanistan, and in his words, he bombed the shit out of Iraq and Syria. He massively ramped up arms sales to the Gulf monarchies and presented a deal of the century, so-called, which would have further solidified the apartheid system that Palestinians live under. Now, since Biden has assumed the presidency, he has made some moves to distance himself from Trump's administration and undo what were actually unpopular policies. He's rejoined the US in the Paris Climate Accords. He has begun the process of withdrawing some of the sanctions on Iran and is in the process of beginning negotiations over the US rejoining the Iran nuclear deal. And he's withdrawn US support for Saudi's war on Yemen. So should we be congratulating Joe Biden? Should we be expecting world peace? The short answer is no. In reality, while these developments are positive, they aren't even the bare minimum of what the world needs. The Paris Climate Accords are woefully inadequate with far too late deadlines on decarbonization. They continue to allow advanced countries like the US to continue polluting and extracting fossil fuels at the expense of countries in the global south. The JPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal, was not a very great deal to begin with. And while it's definitely better than no deal, it is unlikely that sanctions will be removed from Iran entirely, or that the US will stop treating Iran as a threat in the region. His withdrawal of support for the war on Yemen has a big caveat that the US will continue to do everything necessary to protect Saudi's borders, and previously agreed arms sales under the Trump administration are likely to be fulfilled in the years to come. We also saw that earlier this week, Biden announced $200 million in arms sales to Egypt, despite the massive ongoing repression in the country. It was also confirmed that Biden's administration will continue to recognize Juan Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela and maintain its sanctions on Venezuela. And throughout his election campaign, he tried to outdo Trump with his rhetoric against China. And he has said that he would take a tougher line on Russia because, the US has been too soft apparently so far. So what we're really seeing is a kind of return to a nicer, less erratic, pretending to be humanitarian face of US imperialism under Biden. Now, it's foolish to pretend that there's no difference between Trump and Biden, and we should recognize the positive developments for what they are. I mean, obviously, if less people die in Yemen, that's a good thing. But we need to bear in mind that this is not born out of altruism. They are the product of the role of pressure from below in winning these positions. And these are things that need to be built on. And B, they are not the undoing of US imperialism, but a strategic reorientation in the face of imperial decline. Slightly less worse or different imperialism is still imperialism. And Joe Biden, after his inauguration, declared America is back. And for those of us who've long campaigned against US wars, we know that that's not a good thing. And while Biden has tried to boost his credentials by distancing himself from some of the military interventions that happened under Obama's presidency when he was vice president, and sure, he was less of a war hawk than Hillary Clinton, although that's not really a high bar to set. He did oppose Obama's troop surge to Afghanistan, but only because he preferred an alternative, which Obama then later adopted, of using a secret drone program for extrajudicial killings and to recruit local fighters as opposed to having American boots on the ground. And in fact, his current pick for the director of national intelligence, Avril Haines, is someone who was central to that secret drone program. We should also note that among the first things that the Senate and the House of Representatives, which are now both controlled by the Democrats, has done is get passed a $740 billion defense bill, which will be purposed for continuing the war on terror and for a possible new arms race with China and Russia. So I think to put into context where US imperialism is and what we can expect under Biden, it's worth taking a step back and trying to understand the nature of imperialism itself and how it operates today. And I think the key thing that has to be grasped is that imperialism is a function of, or as Lenin called it, the highest stage of capitalism. What Lenin argued was that imperialism emerged as the development and direct continuation of the fundamental characteristics of capitalism in general. And what he meant by this is that competition in a free market, so-called, which capitalists love to tell us is the solution to all the ills in the world, creates inherently within it a concentration of production and subsequently a tendency towards monopolies. And this is a process that is also accelerated during times of crisis. Essentially, what you have with competition is winners and losers, and the winners grow bigger and take over more of the market at the expense of the losers. Bigger companies have the ability to drive smaller companies out of business or to buy them out, or to control them by purchasing controlling shares in their company or through political influence or the rest of it. And contrary to mainstream belief, these kind of predatory and shady practices are not one-offs by rotten eggs, the likes of Philip Green. They are actually incentivized by the system. And so what you end up with very soon is a small number of big companies that dominate the market and who battle for hegemony among themselves in smaller and smaller ways, and often come to agreements and become cartels. And this is also coupled by the same process that takes place among banks and their relationship with industry, as they hold the capital that industrial capitalists need. And when they have monopolist power, they then have huge influence over huge sections of industry. And what Lenin describes is the rapid extension of a close network of canals which cover the whole country, centralizing all capital and all revenues, transforming thousands and thousands of scattered economic enterprises into a single national capitalist and then into an international capitalist economic unit. And in these conditions, you no longer have numerous companies in an industry or banks which, if one of them goes bust, then it's not a big problem. These institutions and banks now become too big to fail and become issues of national importance, like we saw in 2008. And so there's a deepening of the relationship between the monopolists and the state. And Lenin compares some of the fears that capitalists sometimes allude to in the public about being nationalized as no more than the expressions, as it were, of the rivalry between two department managers in the same office, because state monopoly in capitalist society is nothing more than a means of increasing and guaranteeing the incomes of millionaires on the verge of bankruptcy in one branch of industry or another. Now, these processes which Lenin describes happening in the late 19th century ushered in the era of finance capitalism. And the conquering of the national markets, as well as the greater organization of workers, reduced the ability of monopolists to continue expanding their profits at home. And so they turn outwards. And at the time that monopolies became the dominant form of the organization of production according to Lenin, in the most advanced capitalist countries was around 1876. And at this time, roughly 10% of Africa had been colonized by the European powers. By 1900, a mere 24 years later, 90% of Africa had been colonized by the European powers. So what you see is that these corporations and banks rely on the state to provide military force for conquering new economic territory so that they can export capital in order to extract new and more natural resources, access cheap labor, and create new markets. So what we're seeing is that the competition between capitalists on a national level now becomes international against competing imperialist powers. And the scramble to divide up the world, which is also as much about ensuring that foreign rivals can't access those areas as it is about the monopolists and the imperialists having that control themselves. And one kind of later stage of this that Lenin also describes is that similar to monopolists on a national level, you have agreements between rival imperialist powers over their spheres of influence, such as with the Berlin Conference and later with the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And you had, bigger imperialist powers protecting smaller imperialist powers in exchange for transport routes and commodities and so on. But rather than this kind of finalizing the state of affairs and ushering an era of peace kind of thing, what Lenin points out is that this only deepens the unevenness of world capitalism because some powers are stronger than others. And so any agreement between these rival imperialists are essentially moments of truce as opposed to peace, before the struggle continues to repartition the world and to, for the existing imperialist powers to try and gain more control and to reorganize those agreements. How else, Lenin says, under capitalism can the solution of these contradictions be found except by resorting to violence? And he was writing this at the time during the First World War, where exactly that had happened, where the imperialist rivalries of the European powers had erupted into war that in the end cost an estimated 40 million lives. And this was touted as the war to end all wars. It was, of course, nothing of the sort, and in fact, laid the seeds for the next World War. And just lastly to say that, of course, the violence is not just against rival imperialist powers, but is, of course, against the people who are being colonized themselves as well, and the crushing of their national struggles for self-determination. So the reason I think it was important to kind of go through that is to try and understand where that places us today. And I think looking back over the last decade, since the end of the Second World War, we haven't actually seen a day of peace. The competition for spheres of influence between the two dominant powers at the end of the Second World War, US and Russia, produced the Korean and Vietnam Wars, and then the Cold War, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation. And the end of the Cold War also didn't bring an end to imperialism either. It brought up constant struggles for control of the Middle East, of Latin America and Africa, with the US being the primary imperialist force. The end of colonialism from the European colonial powers ushered in an era of neocolonialism, a relationship between advanced imperialist economies of the global north and those of the global south based on debt, asymmetric trade, forced policies by global institutions such as the WTO, IMF, and World Bank that ensure that countries in the global south are subordinate to the interests of Western capital. Today, what sub-Saharan Africa receives in investment and aid is less than a third of the capital flight to the financial capitals of the global north, like the City of London. And what we've seen since 2008 has been an intensification in the global north of the process of concentration of production and monopolization that Lenin described 100 years ago. And with the coronavirus crisis, it's taking place at an accelerated pace. And you can see clear examples of this with companies like Amazon and Tesla and Microsoft and the rest of them. During this last few decades in the neoliberal period, we've seen further financialization of the economy with more and more commodity production outsourced to countries in the global south where companies can find cheaper labor and less regulations and less tax. And what we've also seen is that the huge amounts of quantitative easing and bailouts used to prop up these big monopolies during these times of crisis has deepened the dependence of private capital on the state. And so you have the countries in the global south forced to be dependent on imperialist nations. And you can see what's happening right now in terms of the global vaccine rollout as a clear example. The richest countries in the world have ordered 1 billion extra doses than they need for their populations, while 130 countries haven't had a single dose. And rather than pass on the technology and have some of their pharmaceutical companies miss out on a bit of profit, the UK and France and others are pledging to donate a percentage of their surplus vaccines at the end of the year to countries in the global south. What we also see is the ongoing war on terror and the struggles by the US and its allies in maintaining Western control of over the Middle East and Africa, which continues to breed terrorism, more war, and drives Islamophobia. And one final aspect that I want to touch on is that you have the threat of a new Cold War with China as a rapidly growing industrial nation, which is on course to supersede the US in economic might at some point in the future. And I think on China, I think it's important to say, and I think it's important to analyze China itself and understand that it is in itself an imperialist power in the making. And I would recommend this 2-part article by Dragan Plavchik on Counterfire's website. I'll post a link in the chat during the discussion, which explains this in better detail and goes through the historical context of this. But quite simply, the case is that China is a state monopoly, which is competing internationally to gain control of spheres of influence and of markets. Its model of investment and aid to countries in Africa and Asia in return for access to markets, for relaxing regulations on Chinese companies, and with conditions of purchasing Chinese commodities, is not dissimilar to the Western model of neocolonialism. And China's achieved the rapid development that it has by massively exploiting the working class in its country and restricting their ability to organize, and has internalized the same ideology underpinning the war on terror in the West to oppress the Uyghur minority in its country. Now, of course, China is not on par with the US, which remains the strongest economic and military power in the world right now, and is not the aggressor in this Cold War that's developing with the US. But it doesn't make sense to not understand that the trajectory that China is going on, and to have a clear idea of its role on the world stage at the moment. And I think this brings me to how we fight and oppose imperialism, because I think first and foremost, we have to remember that our enemy is our home. We should have no qualms, for example, about recognizing the human rights abuses in China or the nature of the Chinese state. But that doesn't mean supporting our government's imperialist aims in ramping up tensions with China. And we should offer our solidarity with socialists opposing their government in China. But the job of fighting the Chinese ruling class is for the Chinese people. And that should be our argument. And to make it clear that Western aggression only impedes their ability to do that. Secondly, I think we have to remember that the question of imperialism is not a secondary one. Organizing against imperialism has to be part and parcel of what we do as socialists. Part of why I thought it was a good idea to briefly go through Lenin's explanation of imperialism is to make it clear that there is no separation of the economic and the political. There's no domestic without foreign. And we shouldn't forget that, as well as the human cost of those who are subjected to imperialist wars, the grotesque amounts of money that our government is spending on the military, on weapons of war, is money that is not being used to fund the NHS, to give school children food, etc. So capitalism and imperialism can't be untangled. And I think this means two things for us. It means that, firstly, we have to go beyond simply calling for peace, because the end of a specific war is not the end of imperialism. And imperialism necessitates violence, and moments of quiet are essentially moments of preparation for the next war, and or of the use of less overt methods of war, like sanctions and debt and all the rest of it. Um, and I think it also doesn't draw the links between foreign and domestic policy. And I think that's something we have to be stressing at all times, because war and oppression abroad always go hand in hand with repression and exploitation at home. And I think we obviously have to try and build broad coalitions with people who might not be socialists and might not take this line, and who are genuinely calling for peace with different ideas. But we need to build socialist arguments within the movement, and use the opportunities of opposition to the ruling class when they're engaging in wars and imperialism, to build opposition to the system that produces those wars. Secondly, I think we cannot allow reformist politics to try and separate imperialism and argue that the priority is domestic social concerns. And unfortunately, I think we saw a lot of this during the last 5 years while Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, with some of the people on the Labour left arguing that we shouldn't be taking up these issues until we're in power, and they're not the kind of bread and butter issues and the rest of it. And I remember when I was a member years ago, I was advised in a friendly way by a socialist to maybe stop talking about Palestine for a little while. Maybe don't bring up Trident right now. And more recently, we've seen people like Owen Jones in his recent book has criticized Corbyn for not backing down on foreign policy issues. And I think we have to reject that. And of course, the broader point is that we can't rely on the Labour Party. Corbyn's anti-imperialist politics was an aberration from the party's history. And as Dominic Alexander mentions in his article on why socialists oppose imperialist wars, which I think was emailed out ahead of this meeting, it was precisely the Attlee government's support for the ruling class's imperialism and its determination to build nuclear weapons that impeded on its social policies at home. And even under Corbyn's leadership, we saw that the party voted in support of bombing Syria, it's voted in support of renewing Trident, and in support of limiting solidarity with Palestine, despite Jeremy Corbyn's politics and his objections to all of these. So we need to organize separately and independently. And that, of course, means working with people in the Labour Party and on the Labour left who share our politics, but we have to do that independently. And to bring it back to the US finally, which this meeting is kind of about, the same applies, of course, to the Democrats, and even more so, really. The logic of capitalism necessitates imperialism, and whatever positive steps Biden takes, they are severely limited and only within the scope of maintaining imperialism in different ways. But those positive developments in and of themselves are evidence that pressure from below works. So socialists in the US should take them as partial victories and mobilize on the back of them as widely as possible to demand much more. And here in the UK, as a country with a special relationship with the United States, and still with a significant role in supporting US imperialism, we need to put pressure on our government to at least match what Biden has done in the first instance, for example, over the war in Yemen. And we need to organize further to undermine that special relationship, to end our military interventions abroad, as well as to build solidarity with Palestine, and to campaign, for example, for vaccine equity and debt relief and the rest of it. And we urgently need to build socialist arguments in the movement that take on the roots of imperialism, and build the class struggle, which is ultimately the only way to end it once and for all.